Sometimes the most devastating storms arrive without thunder. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a corporate building when leadership changes hands. It's not the comfortable quiet of a Sunday morning. It's the cautious hush of prey animals sensing a predator nearby. That Friday morning in October, the hallways of Morrison & Associates felt like a mausoleum waiting for its next resident. The kind of silence that made people walk faster, speak in whispers, and glance over their shoulders twice before entering elevators. I'd worked there for 11 years, long enough to read the atmospheric pressure of corporate anxiety like a meteorologist tracking hurricanes. Richard Morrison, our CEO and founder, had announced his temporary medical leave the previous Monday. Minor procedure, the company-wide email had said. Brief recovery period. The words were carefully chosen to sound reassuring, but anyone who'd survived enough corporate reorganizations knew that temporary had a way of becoming permanent the moment the board caught wind of opportunity. And opportunity had a name. Blake Morrison, Richard's son. At 29, Blake carried himself like a walking LinkedIn post, all polished confidence and startup vernacular. He wore expensive jeans to board meetings, quoted Gary Vaynerchuk in casual conversation, and had somehow convinced everyone that his 18-month stint at a failed tech startup qualified him to revolutionize a 40-year-old consulting firm. The board loved his fresh perspective and digital-first mindset, phrases that sounded impressive in PowerPoints but meant nothing when your biggest clients still preferred handwritten thank you notes. Blake's first week as interim CEO had been a masterclass in performative leadership. He'd scheduled back-to-back synergy sessions, installed standing desks in the break room, and mandated that all meetings be conducted via Slack channels, even when participants were sitting in the same room. The younger employees ate it up. The veterans smiled politely and updated their LinkedIn profiles. From my office in the International Relations Wing, I watched it all unfold with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a dying civilization. My space wasn't glamorous. A modest corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. But it was strategically positioned. I could see everything. The hurried conversations by the coffee machine, the closed-door meetings that ran long, the way certain employees had started avoiding eye contact with others. My job had always been about observation, listening, decoding not just words but intention, cultural subtext, the spaces between what people said and what they meant. I spoke 8 languages fluently, not tourist-level conversational skills, but business-grade fluency with cultural nuances that took years to master. Mandarin with regional dialects, Japanese with proper honorifics, Arabic with religious sensitivities, Portuguese that could navigate both Brazilian warmth and European formality. Over the past decade, I'd saved Morrison & Associates millions of dollars in deals that could have gone sideways. I'd mediated contract disputes in Seoul, prevented a logistical nightmare in Sao Paulo, and once spent 48 hours on the phone with customs officials in Frankfurt to prevent a shipment mix-up that would have cost us our biggest European client. But Blake didn't know any of that. He'd never asked, never bothered to review my files or understand what my department actually did. To him, I was just another overhead expense, a relic from his father's era that could be optimized away with the right software solution. The first time we passed in the hallway, he looked right through me. Not with malice, just with the casual blindness of someone who'd already categorized me as irrelevant. He remembered the names of the sales team, nodded enthusiastically at the marketing directors. But when he walked past departments like mine, the ones that did the quiet, essential work, he barely registered our existence. It would have been insulting if it weren't so predictable. That afternoon, a small group of us gathered in the break room for coffee, the kind of informal meeting that happens when veteran employees need to process seismic changes without alerting management. Sarah from accounting was there, along with Marcus from legal and Jennifer from HR, all of us carrying the same expression of polite concern. He's already talking about streamlining operations, Marcus said quietly, stirring his coffee with the mechanical precision of someone who'd seen too many reorganizations. Heard he wants to eliminate redundancies in consulting services. Sarah nodded grimly. The international wing is expensive to maintain. All those language specialists, cultural consultants. I'm sure he thinks Google Translate can handle most of it. I sipped my tea and said nothing. There was no point in arguing with decisions that hadn't been made yet, or trying to explain complexity to people who'd already decided that everything could be simplified. I'd seen enough young executives come through these halls, all convinced they were the first to discover efficiency. But something about Blake felt different. Not because he was sharper, he wasn't, but because he possessed the dangerous confidence that only comes from never having failed at anything important. He'd grown up wealthy, attended elite schools, and landed every job through connections. Failure, to him, was a theoretical concept that happened to other people. That evening, as I finished preparing a briefing package in Mandarin and Portuguese for Monday's client presentation, my email chimed. The subject line made my stomach tighten. Departmental Realignment Review Meeting, Blake Morrison's assistant. The timing was suspicious. 5:47 p.m. on a Friday, scheduled for Monday at 4:30 p.m. No agenda attached. No explanation of what realignment meant, though in corporate speak, it rarely meant anything good. I arrived at the conference room 10 minutes early, partly from habit and partly from curiosity. Blake was already there, scrolling through what I recognized as quarterly performance reviews, spread across the long mahogany table. My file was on top, printed in the stark black and white of corporate documentation. "Natalie, right?" he said without looking up, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who'd never had to earn respect. "Thanks for coming in. We're simplifying operations around here, and your department is a bit specialized." He said specialized like it was a disease. "I've been reviewing the numbers," he continued, finally making eye contact. "International consulting is expensive to maintain in-house. We've decided to outsource language services to a firm in Singapore. It'll cut costs by 60% and streamline our operations." I studied his face, noting the way he delivered the news with the detached efficiency of someone reading from a script. There was no malice in it, just the cold calculation of a spreadsheet made human. "Effective when?" I asked calmly. "Immediately." "Well, end of business today, technically. HR will send you the severance details." He paused, glanced at his phone, then back at me. "We appreciate your time here, of course." I smiled then, not with bitterness, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd just confirmed a suspicion. I slid my laptop across the table and stood up slowly. "Good luck with your meeting Monday," I said, gathering my jacket. He blinked, confused. "What meeting?" "You'll find out." And with that, I walked out of the conference room. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I didn't say another word. But as I made my way down that familiar hallway for what I thought might be the last time, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, but a crystalline clarity about what Blake had just set in motion. Because some storms don't announce themselves with thunder. They arrive silently, gathering strength until the moment they're ready to remake the landscape entirely. The drive home through downtown Chicago gave me time to think. The evening traffic moved with its usual Friday urgency, everyone desperate to escape their corporate cages and pretend for 2 days that their jobs didn't define them. But I wasn't thinking about escape. I was thinking about consequences. Blake had just eliminated the person who managed relationships with clients across 3 continents. He'd done it without consulting anyone who actually understood what I did, without reviewing the active projects I was handling, without considering the delicate cultural protocols that governed our international partnerships. Most importantly, he'd done it 3 days before our biggest client presentation of the year. By the time I pulled into my parking space, I'd already started cataloging everything Blake didn't know he needed to know. The client flying in from Tokyo who insisted on conducting business in formal Japanese. The Brazilian delegation that required specific cultural acknowledgments in their contracts. The ongoing negotiation with a German manufacturer that hinged on understanding regional business customs. All of it now handed off to a faceless firm in Singapore that had never met these clients, never invested in building these relationships, never understood that international business is built on trust that takes years to establish and seconds to destroy. The weekend passed in a strange, suspended quiet. I didn't tell many people what had happened. A few text messages from colleagues who'd heard the news, all carefully worded to avoid seeming too sympathetic. Offices like Morrison and Associates weren't safe spaces for showing loyalty to the departed. Not anymore. I took long walks along Lake Michigan, cleaned my apartment with obsessive thoroughness, and reorganized kitchen drawers that hadn't been touched in months. But my mind kept circling back to the same thought. Blake had no idea what he'd just done. He hadn't just fired an employee. He dismantled a bridge that had taken 11 years to build. International partnerships don't exist in spreadsheets. They live in the pauses between translations, in respectful eye contact, during video calls, in unspoken rituals that matter only if you've taken the time to understand why they matter. But Blake dealt in optics, not depth. He saw costs, not connections. And on Monday morning, he was going to discover the difference. Sunday evening, I prepared a small folder. Not a revenge plan, not yet, but documentation. Copies of emails, screenshots of client communications, a carefully labeled USB drive slipped into a padded envelope. I didn't know exactly what I'd do with it yet, but 11 years of corporate experience had taught me that being prepared was never a mistake, especially when people in power started making decisions based on assumptions instead of understanding. Monday morning arrived gray and humid, with the kind of rain that makes even Chicago look uncertain of itself. I dressed simply, dark slacks, a navy blazer, minimal makeup, and had nowhere important to be. For the first time in 11 years, my Monday didn't begin with reviewing international news, checking time zones, or preparing for early morning calls with clients halfway around the world. It was liberating and unsettling in equal measure. At 9:35 a.m., my phone started buzzing. Unknown number. I let it ring. Second call at 9:42, third call at 9:48, this time from the office main line. I answered but didn't speak. "Natalie?" came a voice, followed by a pause. Then more urgently, "This is Carla from Blake's team." Carla was one of the new hires, young, polished, nervous energy wrapped in designer business casual. She'd started the previous month with the wide-eyed enthusiasm of someone who thought corporate life would be like a Netflix series about ambitious professionals. "Good morning," I said neutrally. "There's a situation with this morning's meeting. The Goldstone Group arrived 30 minutes ago and asked for you specifically." Her voice carried the strained politeness of someone delivering bad news to people who could fire her. "We didn't realize they were expecting you to be present." Mr. Morrison assumed the new language services provider would handle everything. My silence stretched long enough for her to fill it with anxious explanations. "They seem upset that you're not here. The lead negotiator keeps asking when you'll arrive. Mr. Morrison he's trying to explain the transition, but they're not responding well." "They don't want a transition," I said calmly. "They want the person who understands the conversation they're trying to have." Carla went quiet, then whispered, "Would you consider coming in? Just to smooth things over?" I let the question hang in the air for exactly 10 seconds. "I don't smooth things over anymore," I said finally. "Not for Blake." And I hung up. What happened next, I learned later from Sarah in accounting, who'd witnessed the whole scene from the reception area. The meeting had been a disaster before it even began. Kenji Tanaka, the senior vice president from Goldstone, had refused to proceed without me present. When they explained that I'd been transitioned out, he'd simply stood up, bowed politely, and walked out without another word. No raised voices, no dramatic exits, just the kind of silent withdrawal that speaks louder than any argument. The rest of the delegation followed, leaving Blake and his hastily assembled team sitting in the conference room with a presentation they couldn't deliver and a client they no longer had. The Singapore firm had been supposed to dial in for the meeting, but they'd apparently confused time zones and missed it entirely. By lunch, the office was buzzing with whispered conversations. Someone had seen Blake slam his office door. Someone else said the CFO looked like he'd seen a ghost. Carla sent one final message to my personal email, just one line. "I think you should know that Mr. Morrison Sr. is back from medical leave." I read it twice, then smiled, because if there was one person who understood exactly what I'd brought to Morrison and Associates, it was Richard Morrison. And something told me that Monday afternoon was going to be very long for his son. By the time Blake realized the full scope of the consequences, it was already too late. I heard from Marcus, who always knew more than he said when he called that evening. His voice was hushed and urgent, like he was sharing state secrets. "They're in full panic mode," he said. After Goldstone walked out, the CFO demanded an immediate report. Blake tried to bluff his way through it, said it was a cultural misunderstanding, that they were too rigid in their expectations. I leaned back in my chair, watching steam curl up from my tea. And Richard. There was a pause. He walked into the middle of the meeting. I don't think Blake knew he was back. I could picture it clearly. Richard Morrison, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, carrying himself with the quiet authority that comes from building something from nothing. He'd never been loud or flashy. His power came from the way people leaned in when he spoke, because he didn't waste words. "He just stood there for a while," Marcus continued, "didn't say anything. Then he asked one question. Where is Natalie?" Blake had tried to explain about modernization, cost reduction, third-party solutions. Richard had listened. Then he'd turned to the CFO and asked for the Goldstone file. After that, he'd simply walked out of the room. No explosion, no big speech, Marcus said. But his face, Blake looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. I could almost hear the smile in Marcus's voice when he added, "Why are you telling me all this?" "Because you should know," he said. "The building is shifting, Natalie." And everyone's starting to realize who was holding it together. After the call, I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a long time. Not from satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about understanding. I hadn't orchestrated any of this. I hadn't needed to. Blake had lit the match himself. All I'd done was refuse to put out the fire. The next morning, a sleek black sedan pulled up in front of my building. I watched from my second-floor window as a driver got out, checked his phone, and looked up at my unit. I didn't move. I already knew what the message would say. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. From Richard Morrison. Subject: personal meeting request. The email was brief. Just 2 lines. "Natalie, I deeply regret what happened. I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. My office, 10 a.m. No pressure, no demands, just respect." I stared at the screen, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to delete the message and move on. But another part, the part that still carried 11 years of loyalty to the man who'd built Morrison and Associates into something worth working for, knew I needed to hear what he had to say. At 9:55 a.m., I walked into the lobby of Morrison and Associates one more time. It looked the same: polished marble floors, high glass panels, the subtle scent of expensive coffee and printer toner. But something was different. People weren't smiling. Conversations were clipped. The receptionist, who used to greet me by name, now looked up with wide, uncertain eyes, unsure whether I was friend or ghost. The elevator ride was silent. When I entered Richard's office, he was already standing. He looked tired but not defeated, a man who'd stared at the unraveling of his company and returned before it could collapse entirely. "Natalie," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." I nodded. "You asked." He gestured to a chair and sat across from me, no desk between us, no power plays. "I've made a terrible mistake," he said without hesitation, or rather, I allowed one to be made in my absence. "It cost us a partnership I spent 12 years building." "It cost you more than that," I replied. "But I imagine you already know that." He nodded solemnly. "Blake didn't understand what you did for us. Still doesn't, but I do, and I'm sorry." The silence that settled between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was clarifying. "I'm not asking you to come back," Richard said. "I suspect you're already considering better opportunities, and you deserve them. But if you were willing, I'd like to hire you as an independent consultant. Not under Blake. Not under anyone. Full autonomy." He reached for a folder and slid a document across the table. It was clean, direct, 6-month contract, executive-level access, complete independence, triple my previous salary. One sentence in bold at the bottom. "This agreement cannot be amended or revoked by any current or future member of the Morrison family." I almost smiled, but instead looked Richard in the eyes. "I'll consider it." He didn't press, just nodded with the kind of dignity most executives forget the moment power starts slipping from their hands. As I stood to leave, he said one last thing. "You saved this company more times than Blake will ever know. If you choose not to help us again, I'll understand, but either way, I want you to know. He won't be in charge much longer." I left with the offer in my hand and something else in my chest. Not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter, sharper. Control. And I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. I didn't rush to respond to Richard's offer. 11 years of corporate experience had taught me never to jump at an apology wrapped in a contract, especially one written in desperation rather than respect. True power, when wielded correctly, always tries to return dressed in humility. But real humility doesn't ask for favors. It takes responsibility, and Blake had taken nothing but shortcuts. 3 days passed, long enough for the executive floor to grow increasingly anxious. I could feel the tension without even being there. Messages trickled into my inbox, first from HR, then from the CFO, finally from a name I hadn't seen in years. Marcia Chen, head of global partnerships. Her email was careful, full of soft corporate phrases like collaborative solutions, strategic bridge building, and the always reliable moving forward. But beneath the tone, I could hear what she wasn't saying. The cracks were spreading, and they needed me to prevent the walls from collapsing entirely. I responded with a single sentence: "Have Blake call me directly." I didn't want a boardroom full of apologies. I wanted to see if the man who'd fired me could swallow his pride. And he did. 2 hours later, my phone rang. His name lit up on the screen like a headline waiting to fail. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Hi, Natalie," he said quickly, voice tight and rehearsed. "I just wanted to reach out personally to see if we can clear the air and discuss next steps." I didn't respond. Silence has a gravity that some men can't survive. He cleared his throat and continued. "Obviously, there were some misunderstandings previously. I think we both want what's best for the company, and I believe we'd benefit from your insights as we move forward with our international partners." "We?" I echoed, letting just enough frost into the word to make him pause. "Of course, your terms would be respected," he added hastily. "Full consulting authority, remote flexibility, whatever's necessary." He didn't mention the firing, didn't acknowledge the insult, didn't reference the meeting I'd prepared for that had unraveled the moment I was gone. That silence told me everything. "You know," I said calmly, "there's a phrase in Japanese. The nail that sticks out gets hammered down. But in Mandarin, there's another one. Kill the chicken to scare the monkeys. Do you know what they mean?" Blake laughed nervously. "I don't speak either language." "I know," I said. "That's why this happened." I let the silence stretch until he started squirming again. Then I said, "I'll consider the offer, but with one condition." "Of course." "Whatever you need." "I want full access to the client database," I said. "Internal memos, vendor reports, partner communication logs, everything that's gone through the international channel since I left." He hesitated. "That's confidential material. Then we're done here." No, wait." He backtracked quickly. "You'll have access. I'll send the authorization forms tonight." "Good," I said. "Let's schedule our first meeting for Monday morning." "Fantastic," he said, relief creeping into his voice. "Welcome back, Natalie." But I didn't say thank you, because I wasn't coming back to help him. I was coming back to see what he'd broken and how deep the damage went. Monday morning, I walked into Morrison & Associates like a shadow returning to reclaim its space. No announcement was made, no formal introduction, just a credential restored, a visitor's pass quietly converted to permanent authorization, and a temporary office, a cold glass cube between legal and acquisitions. Not an office, a cage with windows. Perfect. I smiled politely, said nothing, and opened my laptop. By noon, I had what I needed. By 3 o'clock, I understood the full scope of the rot. 2 major accounts had started ghosting Morrison & Associates entirely. One had flagged multiple cultural violations in their latest contract draft. Another had already reached out to my former colleague Raul, now working independently in Miami, asking if he knew where I'd gone. And then there was the Singapore firm, the one Blake had hired to replace me. I pulled their reports. Sloppy translations, missed deadlines, tone-deaf language suggestions. The Goldstone fiasco hadn't been an exception. It had been the beginning. Every client I'd once nurtured now saw Morrison as unstable, disrespectful, unreliable. And they were right. I compiled a summary, not just a list of failures, but a roadmap of how they could have been avoided, a quiet ledger of losses. Then I scheduled a private meeting. Not with Blake, with Richard. He arrived on time, alone, tired, but listening. "I have what you need," I told him, "but I'm not here to rebuild what your son dismantled." He nodded, as if he already knew. "I'm here to show him what happens when you confuse fluency with relevance and loyalty with redundancy." Richard didn't interrupt. He just asked, "What do you need?" I smiled then, cold and clean. Just space, and your silence. Because revenge, when done properly, isn't loud. It's silent, patient, surgical. And Monday was just the beginning. The trick to dismantling a structure isn't to kick down the walls, it's to find the load-bearing beams, the ones nobody notices, and remove them slowly, carefully. Let gravity do the rest. That's what I did. Every morning, I arrived early, long before the suits filled the hallways with artificial energy. I didn't make noise, didn't bark orders, didn't announce my presence. I simply worked, quietly, surgically, thoroughly. I reviewed Blake's communications with our international clients. Most were laughable. Form emails, copy-pasted translations, stripped of nuance and warmth. In one deal with a Tokyo-based firm, he'd addressed the CEO by his first name in the subject line. Twice. In Portuguese correspondence, he'd mixed formal and informal tones, effectively calling a senior partner buddy. And in a Chinese contract, a liability clause had been mistranslated to imply the client would cover our penalties for breach. That one nearly cost us a $12 million renewal. It wasn't just linguistic incompetence, it was cultural arrogance. I documented everything, quietly flagged files, cross-referenced dates, logged complaints that had been buried or ignored. Each note added weight to the case I was building, not to punish, but to prove that respect isn't optional, and that competence can't be outsourced. While I worked in methodical silence, Blake strutted through the building with performative energy. Rushed meetings, loud hallway conversations, LinkedIn posts about modern leadership in a global era. I crossed paths with him once in the break room. He gave me a tight, toothless smile. "How are things going?" he asked, like a man trying to make peace with a loaded weapon. I smiled gently. Smoothly. He didn't understand the joke. That afternoon, I called Mr. Kenji, CEO of the Japanese firm we were about to lose. We hadn't spoken in almost a year, not since Richard's final trip before his health declined. Kenji answered on the first ring. "Natalie," he said, warmth evident even through the static connection. "You have returned." "Briefly," I replied, "as a consultant. But I wanted to contact you before any decisions were made." He was quiet for a moment. "Your company has forgotten our culture, our expectations." "I'm aware." "And now they remember, but only because they're afraid." I didn't defend Morrison and Associates, didn't offer empty apologies. Instead, I said the only thing that mattered: you were right to feel offended. That earned me another respectful silence, more valuable than any PR campaign. "We will delay our decision for 1 week," Kenji said finally, "but we expect more than words." "You'll have them," I said. After the call, I didn't report back to Blake. I didn't need to. He hadn't even noticed that Kenji had stopped returning calls. Instead, I began restoring what had been broken. I personally rewrote the contract in Japanese, complete with proper honorifics, localized phrasing, and embedded etiquette notes. I attached it to a handwritten letter. Yes, a real letter, sealed with the company's original gold-embossed letterhead, a gesture that meant something. And while I did that, the cracks inside Morrison and Associates widened. The Brazilian company canceled an upcoming site visit. The Indian tech partner withdrew funding from a joint research proposal. One of our senior regional consultants resigned, citing irreconcilable leadership differences. The board started whispering. By Thursday, Blake looked like a man walking on cracking ice, moving faster, stumbling in presentations, calling meetings that led nowhere. He tried to blame the delay with Kenji's company on communication lag. The CFO didn't believe him, neither did Marcia. Then came the internal memo, marked confidential but forwarded anyway. First to me, then to half the building. Subject line: Board Discussion Interim Director Performance. That night, I stayed late in the office drinking cold green tea from a chipped mug I'd kept in my desk drawer since year 3. Blake's voice echoed faintly from the conference room, fast, defensive, alone. At 9:18 p.m., I received a short text from Richard. "Final meeting tomorrow, 8:30 a.m., my office." No other details. I leaned back, letting the quiet settle around me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It never really had been. It was about truth, about competence, about the cost of underestimating the people who keep the machine running, not loudly but smoothly, patiently, with a care that can't be replicated by an app or outsourced to strangers on the other side of the world. I closed my laptop, stood slowly, and walked through the empty office, past the glass walls, the flickering screens, the echo of misguided ambition. I thought about the first time I'd walked into this building. Young, focused, hopeful. Tomorrow I'd walk in again, but not as the quiet one they'd forgotten to ask, as the one they'd have to answer to. The next morning I arrived at Morrison and Associates 15 minutes early. Not from nerves, not to prepare. I simply wanted a moment to stand still. The lobby was quiet, the kind of silence that follows when people are holding their breath. Eyes followed me as I walked across the marble floor. Some curious, some cautious, some relieved. No one spoke. No one had to. The air said enough. I took the elevator to the top floor and stepped into silence. Richard's assistant gave me a respectful nod and gestured toward the glass doors. Inside, the conference room was half full. Richard sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 board members I recognized from shareholder meetings. Marcia was there, along with the CFO, and at the far end of the room, in a chair slightly too large for his posture, sat Blake, He didn't look at me. I took my seat next to Richard without a word. The documents in front of me were already arranged, ordered, intentional. My report, my audit, my proposal. The room settled. Richard began. Thank you all for coming. This meeting isn't disciplinary, it's strategic. We've gathered to address performance issues that have affected several of our international partnerships in recent months. No one interrupted. We've also invited Natalie here today, Richard continued, because she's the only person in this room who can explain what actually happened. He turned to me. I didn't speak immediately. I opened my folder and slid the first document across the table. This, I said, is a timeline of Morrison's international division over the past 90 days. A second page. This is a record of all miscommunications, missed cultural markers, and contract violations made by our Singapore-based provider, hired without verification to replace me. Then a third. This is a breakdown of revenue lost or currently at risk due to partner disengagement. I let silence spread between each page. None of these problems existed before I was fired. Across the table, one of the board members adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. Are you saying these losses stem directly from Blake's decision to eliminate your position? I'm not saying that, I replied. The partners are saying it. I opened my final document. These are direct statements from 3 international partners, including Kenji, declaring their willingness to return under one condition. The room waited. I looked directly at Blake. That I stay and that he resign. Blake finally looked up. His face had the rigidity of someone trying to contain emotion but not knowing which one. He opened his mouth, but Richard raised a hand. No more spin, Blake, he said quietly. We've seen the numbers. Heard the silence. But Blake began, then stopped. There was nothing left to say. Richard addressed the board. Effective immediately, I'm reinstating myself as acting CEO. Blake will take indefinite leave from operations, and the leadership board will reevaluate the structure of our global partnerships department. The vote was unanimous. I didn't say anything, didn't gloat, didn't even look at Blake again. I collected my papers, and as I stood, Richard said, Natalie, if you're willing to stay, I'd like you to lead the rebuilding of our international strategy team. I paused, then smiled, not widely, not sharply, just completely. I'll need a new office, I said. Richard smiled back. Choose one. As I walked into the hallway, I passed Blake. He didn't speak, but I did. Quietly, so only he could hear. You fired me because you didn't understand what I did. You brought me back hoping I'd save what you broke. But I didn't come back for you, Blake. He blinked, still not meeting my eyes. I came back so you could see the difference between having power and deserving it. And I kept walking. That afternoon, I sat in a sunlit corner office on the 12th floor. The desk was empty, clean, a fresh start. I opened my laptop, poured a cup of jasmine tea, and wrote my first email of the day to Kenji. Subject, renewal with respect. As I hit send, I thought about everything that had happened. Not just the loss, the insult, the dismissal, but the assumption behind it all. That experience could be replaced. That loyalty didn't matter. That relationships were disposable. They were wrong. You can't outsource fluency. You can't automate trust. And if you mistake silence for weakness, don't be surprised when the quiet ones bring down your entire system with precision, not noise. Some endings don't come with applause. They come with balance restored, and that's more than enough. What would you do if you were in Natalie's position? Would you have returned to rebuild what Blake destroyed, or would you have walked away without looking back? Share your thoughts about workplace respect, competence, and the power of quiet leadership in the comments below. Jawaars. Epilogue. 6 months later. The Chicago skyline looked different from my new corner office. Sharper somehow, more purposeful. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the river winding its way toward Lake Michigan, carrying the debris of winter toward something cleaner, more open. Morrison and Associates had stabilized, then thrived. The Goldstone partnership was stronger than ever, built on the foundation of trust that Blake had nearly destroyed. We'd added 3 new international clients, including a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland that specifically requested to work with me after hearing about our cultural competency restoration. That phrase had become something of a legend in Chicago business circles, a cautionary tale about the cost of undervaluing institutional knowledge. Harvard Business Review had even reached out for an interview, though I'd politely declined. Some stories are better told through results than words. Blake's indefinite leave had quietly become permanent. Last I heard, he was in San Francisco working for a cryptocurrency startup that specialized in disrupting traditional consulting paradigms. Some people never learn that not everything needs to be disrupted. Some things just need to be understood. Richard had stepped back into his role with renewed energy, though he'd made it clear that succession planning would now involve a longer, more careful process. "We'll find the right leader," he'd told me over coffee the previous week, "someone who understands that innovation means improving what works, not destroying what you don't understand." The morning sun cast long shadows across my desk as I reviewed the agenda for our 10 a.m. call, with a potential client in Seoul. The preliminary materials were in Korean, naturally, but I'd also prepared notes in English for the team members who'd be joining. Teaching had become an unexpected part of my new role, not just bridging languages, but building bridges between cultures and colleagues. My assistant knocked and entered with a cup of green tea and a knowing smile. "The Seoul call is ready when you are," she said, "and congratulations on the promotion announcement." I'd almost forgotten. The press release would go out this afternoon, Director of Global Strategy and Cultural Intelligence. It was a mouthful of a title, but it captured something important. The idea that international business success required more than just translation services. It required intelligence, both cultural and emotional. As I prepared for the call, I thought about the lesson I'd learned that gray Monday morning when Blake had dismissed me so casually. Power isn't about the authority to eliminate people. It's about the wisdom to recognize value, even when it comes quietly. The truly dangerous people in any organization aren't the ones who make the most noise. They're the ones who understand the system so deeply that they can either maintain them or dismantle them with surgical precision. Blake had learned that lesson the hard way, but some knowledge can only be earned through consequence. And consequences, I'd discovered, have their own patient gravity. The phone rang, connecting me to Seoul. I answered in perfect Korean, with the proper honorifics and cultural context that would make this conversation not just successful, but meaningful. Outside my window, Chicago hummed with its usual ambitious energy. But up here, in this quiet corner of the business world, I'd found something more valuable than revenge or validation. I'd found my voice, not loud, not demanding, but clear, competent, and impossible to ignore. Some storms, after all, don't just destroy. They clear the air for something better to grow. And in the silence that follows, the truly essential people get back to work. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more.